Hey, Michael with X-Force PC. So we feel like we make really good PCs here at X-Force PC. And in general, I don't pay the competition a whole lot of mind, but every now and again, it's not a bad idea to take a look at the competition. So what I did is I ordered a PC from a large online retailer, something similar to what we're building with our RTX system. And I wanted to see what type of components they're using, even their packaging, and just some of the design choices they made. So it has arrived, and now it's time for an unboxing. So let's do that now. Okay, so what we have here is the Cyberpower PC, and on the side here it says it's the ultimate gaming system, performance mid-tower gaming PC. And I can tell you that it has a i7-9700K. The specs aren't super specific. Has 16 gigs of RAM, I don't know what speed, a 256 gig SSD, a 2 terabyte hard drive, and an RTX 2070, and a 600 watt power supply. So all of that sounds pretty good, but let's see, did they succeed? Because you don't really know a lot of things like what kind of power supply is it, who made it, what's the motherboard chipset. Okay, there's a mouse, free gaming mouse pad when you register. Here's a thing that talks about, so apparently they use foam. They stick a foam thing inside the computer and then it expands, and that holds the graphics card and other things in place. So let's dump this out here. All right. Dumping out. I want it to come out. It's rather embarrassing. Oh, okay, there we go. Now it came out. Whew. Okay, so we have a Cyberpower PC keyboard. It's a membrane keyboard. Nothing's going to be special about this. It has colored keys where you're, where you'd control your first-person shooter type stuff. But it's a membrane keyboard. Nothing particularly special. We got a power cord. We got a couple of antennas for our Wi-Fi here. Now we have this foam, which is pretty good foam. It's kind of the cushy stuff, which is good. And then take this foam off the other side and expose the feet on the bottom. I'm sure this is very elegant online on the video here. All right, so we have our Cyberpower PC out of the box. They do have, we do this too. We put a label over the monitor ports, but basically they're saying don't plug your monitor in right here because that's the onboard graphics and you don't want to use that. You want to use the graphics card, which is right here. And already looking here, it looks like it might be kind of hard to plug something in here because it's real close to being obstructed by the case itself. But anyway, we roll around this way. This is that bag I was talking about. So there's some sort of chemical inside, and whenever you put the bag in here, you start the chemical reaction. And this, by the way, is a tempered glass side. That's good, better than having plexiglass. So that's sort of an upper level thing over plexiglass. And anyway, you've got this foam thing that sort of held the graphics card in place. One thing I see right off is there's some things in here that don't match the picture on the website exactly, but it's pretty close. We'll reserve judgment on what we see inside here for later. Spin this around to the front. Yeah, we have this plastic that you peel off the front. I'm not going to peel this off because I'm not totally sure if this thing isn't going back or not. And then we have some ventilation here on the side, which could be kind of restrictive. We'll find out. We'll find out. So that's pretty much the unboxing process. Now let's hook this thing up to a monitor, see if it works, and see if they sent us what we actually ordered. All right, so let's fire this thing up. I have hooked it up. And we're just going to use this from a customer's perspective. You know, I'm not going to go into the technical aspects yet of this system and what I think of those. We're just going to use it like a customer would. And of course, I'm aimed at the wrong monitor. I need to be aimed at this one. So let's see what we get here as we power on the Cyberpower PC. This Cyberpower PC is known as the Gamer XTreme C790T. So this thing is extreme, so I expect to see some pretty extreme stuff here. So and go through here and answer these questions that I've answered many a time. Just going to call myself owner. And let's boot right on in to Windows. And now I'm going to hook up the internet. And we'll see what happens next. Okay, so we're here now at the Windows desktop. We just got, I guess you'd say signed in, for lack of a better term. Let's see what we got here. We do have our 9700K, 16 gigs of DDR4 2400. That's pretty disappointing. That's very 2 years ago. Our C drive, we have a Lexar SSD. I'm not very familiar with Lexar. Let's see if it is 256. Yes, it is 256. We do have a 2 terabyte mechanical D drive, which is a Seagate 2 terabyte. And then we do have our RTX 2070. So it looks like they did send us what we ordered. And I'm just going to do, of course, the NVIDIA drivers are out of date, but that's to be expected. This may have been in the box for a little while. So now I'm just going to go, I think is the next thing that I should do is run Windows Update. So let's see. We're probably going to have a million updates to do, but let's see how far behind we are. Version 19. Yeah, it doesn't look like this is too far out of date, so that's pretty good. We're downloading a cumulative update for 1909, Windows 10 1909, and that's fairly current. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a bazillion updates to install. As far as bloatware goes, let's have a look here. Microsoft Office is on here, so inevitably that's going to be a trial of Microsoft Office, I think. I'm almost certain. But yeah, I'm not seeing a lot of bloatware other than, I mean, I do see Office installed on here, and I'm pretty darn sure that doesn't come pre-installed on Windows. I believe that's something they put on here. Yeah, I'm sure it is. I don't remember ever seeing Office installed when I install a Windows-based operating system, but that's not too bad. That's the only piece of bloatware. There's no trial version of an antivirus program that I can see, so very minimal bloatware, which is good to see. What we'll do is we'll let all the updates install, and then we'll come back and we'll see if this thing can cool itself. First of all, we'll do some stress testing. Is it stable? Things like that. Okay, so we've run all the Windows updates and all that good stuff, and now we want to do a little bit of stress testing, and we've kind of run into our first problem here. While this chip will run about 4.5 gigahertz or so when a single threaded load is put on it, I've just put a demo version, trial version of AIDA64 on here. And let's do a stability test. And one thing you'll notice right away is within seconds, we're thermal throttling, 12%, 17%. And our CPU speed continues to drop accordingly. We're at 100 degrees Celsius, which is the ultimate red line on the processor. 100 you're seeing right there. 100 degrees. You never want to see that. 90 should be your kind of red line. You know, you never really want to go over 90. We're hitting 100. 100 is where the CPU says, oh no, I'm not going above this. I'm going to slow down over here. Notice our speed is now dropped down to close to 4 gigahertz. Now, our equivalent system that I'm comparing this to will run 4.8 gigahertz continuously for hours on hours and hours. Stay at 4.8 gigahertz, and the temperatures will remain in the 80s the entire time while doing it. Here, we're just pegged at 100, completely pegged at 100. And we're down to 4 gigahertz now on our processor. Now, if I was running the graphics card at the same time, which I can check this little box and do, you're going to see the problem get even worse, because the graphics card is going to put, it was located right below the processor, and all of that heat from the graphics card is going to waft upwards towards the processor. And gradually, through what we call heat soak, you're going to see the problem get worse. We're up to 27% overheating or throttling. We're down now to 3.9 gigahertz, and if we let this run long enough, the problem should get worse and worse and worse because of that graphics card beginning to heat up. I just started the graphics card test, and typically what I like to do is, instead of running the AIDA64 one, because it runs something called CUDA, which is not really gaming, I prefer to run the Heaven benchmark at the same time I'm stressing the CPU. So Heaven benchmark will stress the graphics card, while AIDA64 stresses the processor and memory. And so what we'll start to see is the graphics card's at about 63 degrees right now. And of course our processor's pegged at 100 degrees. We're at about 3.93 gigahertz. Let's come back in just a minute and see where we are. Okay, so we've been running the Heaven benchmark and AIDA64 for only 8 minutes. And the room is actually starting to smell like hot plastic sort of smell. Not burning plastic, but just sort of a hot, or like you've turned a burner on the stove on full blast, but there's nothing on it. It's a weird smell to describe. But I think a lot of that has to do with the fact our processor is still pegged at 100 degrees. Now it keeps slowing itself down. It's dropped into the 3/8 at times down here to try to slow itself down and try to stay under 100 degrees. Our throttling has wavered between 15 and 27% CPU throttling, meaning you're losing between 15 and 27% of your performance. Now, I will say we are running 100% load on all cores, but when you're burning in a system, this is how you have to burn it in, because who's to say the person that buys a system won't edit a video? And when you edit a video, you're running all of your processing cores at 100%. And possibly your graphics card as well, depending on what software you're using. Now, if you were just playing a game, this throttling probably wouldn't happen because you wouldn't be maxing out all 8 cores. But again, you build the system to the worst case scenario. And clearly, that's not what's happened here. So what we're going to do now, I think, is take a look at the interior components and see if we can figure out where everything went wrong. Well, hey, one more thing I wanted to point out before we look at the interior components is I can tell that the case fans on this thing, there's one case fan and we'll look at it closely in a minute, one in the back and 2 in the front. They're all running at a constant speed. In other words, they don't speed up whenever the system is under a heavy load, and they don't slow down whenever you're just typing an email. They're running at a constant speed, drawing the same amount of air through. The way it should be done is all the case fans should be hooked to the motherboard, and they should all speed up when things get hot, slow down when things get cool. It's important that they slow down when things get cool because number 1, it reduces noise, and number 2, it reduces the amount of dust you're going to draw through your system. But here, they've just plugged the case fans directly into the power supply, and the case fans run at the same exact speed all of the time. Now, the ones on the graphics card, and especially the one on the processor, is really working hard right now. And I'm going to take my microphone and move it close. So, I don't know if you can pick that up, but that's the processor fan futilely attempting to keep the processor under 100 degrees. So, now we will take a look at why all this is happening. Okay, so we have the system now unplugged, and I took the front cover and the back cover off. And let's talk about the things that they got right first. The case itself is an attractive looking case. It's fine. It has a spot for a fan on the top, even though they don't have one there. USB 3.0 times 2, a headphone microphone jack, a power LED, and a hard drive LED. Power and reset. Kind of standard stuff for the front, but you know, good that it's there. Because it's sort of what you would expect. They did use 2 sticks of RAM for dual channel memory. That's important. That can have as much as a 20 or so percent effect, 15%, something like that effect on performance, depending on what you're actually running at the time. 15 would be kind of a worst case scenario on that. It does appear that it's 2400 speed RAM, which is very slow by today's standards. And yes, indeed, it is 2400. It's Team Vulcan RAM, which is fine. We use Team Vulcan. But the very slowest RAM we buy is 2666, and that goes into our budget system. This is more of a, I would say, upper middle. At least it's supposed to be, because this is the Gamer XTreme C790T. Gamer XTreme. The cable management is pretty good in here. I'll give them credit for that. They've used the cable management properly. This is a little, I don't know, in your face, but I'm not really sure what else they could do. They maybe could have come around back. It's fine. It's fine. The cable management is fine. I think I might have mentioned they did give us everything that we were supposed to get. We got the i7, we got the RTX 2070, we got 16 gigs of RAM. So those are the things that are done right. Now let's talk about the things that aren't done right. So I'm going to make a cut here and we'll be right back. Okay, so now we're at the back and I'm going to zoom in just a little bit here. And so let's take a look at some of the other things that I mentioned earlier. So here are all the fans. They're all plugged into the Molex connectors here in a row. Here are the connectors that would have connected to the motherboard. I don't know if you can see that in the light here. I'm going to use my flashlight, shine the light on it. This could have plugged into the motherboard, but instead they plugged them all into Molex connectors, and they just plug straight into the power supply and run at 100% speed all the time. Down here we have our 2 terabyte hard drive, and we have a 256 gig SSD. Now, I don't like mechanical hard drives, and so in our equivalent system, we give you a 1 terabyte. Oh, they've got it zip tied in here, which that isn't necessarily a bad thing. That keeps the thing from falling out, you know, in shipping. But I don't like mechanical hard drives, so we would actually give you a 1 terabyte SSD here. And we would use an M.2 SSD. This is an old SATA style SSD. So there's more cabling. As you see, I had to unplug here with SATA. And SATA is limited to about 525 or so megabytes per second read and write speed. And so I don't know if this one can hit that or not. It's a Lexar 256 gig. I'll look up the price online of this particular SSD. I bet this SSD costs about 25 bucks maybe. So 30 bucks, maybe 30 bucks. So do you want your whole system booting off of a $25, $30 SSD? I don't know, I wouldn't, but anyway, they choose to give you a 256 gig SSD, which will fill up quickly, and then you have to manage your storage by copying stuff over to the mechanical hard drive, which is right down here. Again, we prefer to give you a large SSD. Our smallest on this type of system would be a 1 terabyte, so 4 times the size of this, and it would be an M.2 style SSD, which of course, I don't have one handy, but it looks like a little stick of gum, and there is an M.2 port on this motherboard right here. You'd stick it right there. And an M.2 SSD, if it's using the NVMe protocol, can go up to 3,000, something like that, megabytes per second. And the one we use is 1,800 megabytes per second. There's another one we use that's about 2,400 megabytes per second. As I mentioned earlier, the SATA protocol is, or bus, whichever you want to call it, is limited to about 500. So even if you got the very fastest SATA SSD you could possibly get, it's not going to do more than about 525, 550 megabytes per second, which is still, I mean, that's still okay. I mean, an SSD is good, but why they wouldn't just put the SSD here, I don't know. It might have actually even been cheaper to put an M.2 SSD on here. I'll probably try to flash something up on the screen as far as pricing goes for something like that. Back around to the back side again. I guess the cable management is okay. I mean, they just kind of wound it up here. At the very end, they did sort of shove the wires in, but you know, cable management is fine. We've got the CPU power running down here. This is one of the fan cables that's running with it. You know, again, I just have a problem with how they plugged all the fans in, running at 100% speed all the time. The other thing is the way the air gets into this case, none of the air comes in the front. It all has to come in through the side here. So these fans are blowing in, and it has to take them through these little grates here, and there is no filtration. So dust is just going to get right in, unless it happens just to build up on these little fins. If I turn it at an angle, you can probably see that you know, there are little slits here. But there is no filtration. So, you know, all of our upper end systems have some form of filtration to keep the dust out. And the dust is going to build up pretty quickly in here because the fans run at 100% speed all of the time because of the way they're just plugged right into the power supply here. Now the power supply, we'll talk about that for a second. It's a 600 watt. I've got to Google it. I've never heard of it before. It was like a CHT or something like that, made in China, 600 watt. I think it is supposedly gold rated. So I'm going to Google this part number, and if I can find it, I'll put something up on the screen regarding that power supply. The wattage is fine. I don't know about, I've never heard of this particular brand, so I can't speak to whether or not the power supply will be, reliable or not. lastly, on the back here, we have the I/O shield here. A lot of wasted space here. Could have put maybe some USB ports here. I've never seen this much blank space on an I/O shield before. We've got two USB 2.0s, two USB 3.0s. Looks like that's a 3.1 and a Type-C. And of course we have the HDMI that you're not supposed to use, and we have our graphics card down here. So there you go. There is the Cyberpower PC. A lot of questionable choices here. The B360 motherboard, the underpowered cooler. I may stick a better cooler on here and see if I can show you the difference. So that may come up next here in a second. Slow RAM 2400, B360 motherboard that only supports 2666 speeds. Has less PCI Express 3.0 lanes. I think it has 12, and the Z390 has 24 high-speed lanes, if my memory serves correctly. So yeah, I'm happy, I guess, that the PC arrived intact with the pieces and parts that they said would be in here, but I'm disappointed when I look at the fine print, so to speak, the way the fans are done, the chipset on the board, the poor cooling on the processor, the type of SSD that's used, no filtration on the case, fans running at full speed all the time, case fans are. All those things are very disappointing, and yeah, I may just throw a better cooler on here and let you see the difference. Okay, so I started looking at the cooler in Cyberpower. Shame on you. See, we got a problem here. Hopefully that's in focus. The thermal paste, you'll notice, isn't even really melted on this one side. And what I found is when I went to remove the cooler, one of these connections was not seated properly. So the chip was never seated properly on here. And the thing is, if they'd done burn-in testing, they would have seen the ridiculous temperatures that were going on. And they would have said, huh, something's not right. We need to check the cooler and make sure it's installed properly. So clearly nobody's testing. They're not stress testing these things. This is still a pathetic cooler, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this paste is pretty dried up now. I'm going to remove the paste from here. I'm going to apply some softer, not dried up paste. I'm going to reinstall this cooler. It's still not going to cool very well, but we're going to see how much better it does. If you recall before, we were throttling down to about 3.89 gigahertz. And let's see if we can do a good bit better once someone who knows what they're doing puts the cooler on correctly. Okay, so I have now installed the cooler correctly. Let's see if it makes a difference. Well, I assure you it'll make a difference. But let's see how quickly so before we throttled instantly within 10 seconds, or as quickly as the program could update, we were throttling. And our clock speed dropped as well considerably. So now let's see how we do. We are now running 100% load on the processor. We're running at 4.5 gigahertz at the moment. And we haven't throttled yet. Look at that. We're at 70 something degrees. We're still at 4.5 gigahertz. Now, we're not running a load on the graphics card, and that will affect cooling since this is an air-cooled system. You start having the graphics card spew heat, it's going to heat up that processor a little bit more. So let's just turn that on. And let's let it run. So we're at about 4.3 gigahertz, and this is what you would expect to be at, because it'll stay at that higher turbo speed for a little while, but then eventually it will drop down. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we clock all of our systems in this price range at 4.8, and they will stay at 4.8 all the time. And we go with a higher end cooling solution, an overclocking motherboard, yada, yada, yada. But let's let this run now for 8 minutes and see where we are after 8 minutes. I mean, we already see we're better. Before we throttled after 10 seconds, but we'll let it run for 8 minutes like I did before. Hey, Michael here again. We're 5.5 minutes into this thing, and we've settled in right at around 80 degrees on our processor, so we're going to sort of call it good on that. And our speed has been around 4.25 gigahertz. If you remember before, we were down at 3.8, but we were pegged at 100 degrees. And remember I said I smelled like a hot sort of smell, like when you turn a burner on a stove on with nothing on it? That smell has gone away. Now, I still don't like this cooler they're using. It's still crap, but it is getting the job done quite loudly. I'm going to put my microphone over here. It's not going to scare children or anything, but it's pretty loud. So what this tells me, let me take a step back. I've done this before. I've installed coolers incorrectly. I've done it in the last 3 or 4 days. I forgot to tighten down the water block on a water cooler, and the temperatures spiked. But here's the thing. I tested it before I shipped it out, and the temps went whoosh, up to 100 degrees, and I'm like, whoa, hold on. I shut the computer down. I'm like, okay, something's not right here. The pump's not running, something. And I caught the problem. I mean, the thing is you test it before you ship it, and you catch this before it goes out. This, I seriously doubt occurred during shipping. The way these coolers mount, it's highly unlikely that this came loose during shipping. This was probably this way when it was built. It was never quite installed correctly, and essentially there are 4 points that hold the cooler down, and one of those points when I went to loosen it was already loose and had never been clicked in. And again, burn-in testing, you'd have seen it. We're approaching our 8 minutes now. Again, we're right at 80 degrees, and I told you 80 degrees is kind of where, you know, between 80 and 90, and we always want to see our system stay in the 80s under full load. Again, we'd be at more like 4.8 gigahertz here instead of 4.2, but we are now staying within thermal limits. But yeah, I don't think this system was tested. That's the only thing I can come up with as to why it could go out like this.